Saturday Night Slam Masters, as illustrated on here last week, is simply one of the greatest pro wrestling games ever made. Back in Capcom's heyday, still hot off of the success of Street Fighter 2, they carved out one of the most fun pro wrestling experiences that had ever been delivered in video game form. Bearing in mind that this game was a title that came from the same company who put out Street Fighter, there would certainly be some similarities between the two games. And, rather interestingly, Capcom would even tie the two games' lores together into one cohesive narrative, along with the likes of Final Fight and Captain Commando too. Despite all of this, the game offered enough unique features to stand on its own 2 feet as a dynamic, innovative experience. But what if I told you that this popular cult classic received a full-blown sequel just 1 year later? That would play vastly different to its predecessor, instead seemingly taking more inspiration from Street Fighter 2 than even the last game. In today's video we are going to take a look at this obscure Capcom title, discuss its history and analyse what it has in common with both the original Saturday Night Slam Masters and of course Capcom's greatest cash cow ever made. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2, Capcom's most shameless Street Fighter 2 clone. Yeah! Back in 1993, Saturday Night Slam Masters really did bring a lot to the table. Most wrestling games released on home consoles in the West were published by LJN and were sold on the basis that you could play as your favourite wrestlers from the WWF, rather than being developed with any real intent of offering a top level gameplay experience. This is where Saturday Night Slam Masters was so different, as it puts gameplay first and at the forefront above the use of famous celebrities and big brands to make quick sales. Aesthetically, the game's character sprites and other elements of the game look graphically very similar to Street Fighter 2, and as mentioned earlier, the game's lore even tied the two together. For example, we can play as Gunlock, who is said to be Guile's brother, and more importantly, we can play as Mike Hagar from Final Fight, a franchise that has existed in the same universe as Street Fighter from day one. The gameplay itself though is vastly different from Street Fighter, in that characters have full movement around the ring, rather than being locked to a single plane, and characters can whip each other against the ropes and perform high risk top rope manoeuvres. You can even have 4-man matches in this game too, supporting up to 4 players, and victory is only achievable via pinfall, submission or countout, if action is taken out the ring for too long. All the events of this game may occur within the Street Fighter universe, but very different gameplay is presented to the players, and as a result, people loved this game in the arcades, and it would receive some of the best home conversions of any game for both the Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive. The franchise seemed like it had a great future ahead of itself. Just like Street Fighter 2 itself, Saturday Night Slam Masters even got treated to an updated iteration known as Muscle Bomber Duo Ultimate Team Battle, released like the original game for Capcom's CP System-Arcade hardware, which was much like the Capcom System 1 arcade board, only it utilised the Q sound chip that would later be included in the Capcom System 2 board. Speaking of the Capcom System 2 board, this in itself was released the same year as Saturday Night Slam Masters and Muscle Bomber Duo, and the hardware would feature Super Street Fighter as one of its early titles, a title that was a graphically souped up version of Street Fighter 2, offering new moves and 4 new playable characters. The game was of course a massive commercial success for Capcom, which very clearly appeared to bleed into the inspiration for Slam Master's true sequel, released in the following year of 1994. The wrestling game sequel would be the first game in the series developed to run on the Capcom CP2 hardware, but would sadly drop many of the features included within the first game that made it so special, all of which we will dive into shortly. But first, I feel it is important to touch a little more on Capcom in 1994 overall. 1994 seemed to be a period where Capcom as a company were really doubling down on trying to make money from Street Fighter 2. They seemed more focused than ever before in looking for ways to milk the possibilities the game presented them with. When it comes to this, you don't have to look very far at all to see why this would have been the case. 1994 was the year that a high-budget live-action Street Fighter movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme saw release, So with Capcom and its versus fighters being more mainstream than at any point in history before, it seemed to make commercial sense to carry on feeding off of the brand. The console and arcade games based on the movie would not be ready until 1995, but Capcom would push out yet another edition of Street Fighter II, Super Street Fighter II Turbo, a game that is most notable for featuring Akuma as a hidden opponent at the end of the game. The company would also famously use the Super Street Fighter engine to create and release Darkstalkers for Night Warriors that year too, a Street Fighter II-like game featuring an entirely different coat of paint from any previous Capcom fighter. On top of this though, there was another game that seemed to use the Street Fighter engine once again, which for some reason seems to receive nowhere near as much coverage. It is of course Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2, or as it's known in Japan, Super Muscle Bomber The International Blowout, which naming wise seems like an honest nod to Super Street Fighter II The New Challenger, as in both games they brought each respective franchise to the CP2 hardware for the first time. Immediately upon starting up this arcade exclusive, the game informs players that the game's character illustrations are by Tetsuo Hara, the same gentleman who worked on Saturday Night Slam Masters and the same gentleman behind the artwork in Fist of the North Star. At first glance you will instantly notice that the game's format has been completely changed from the previous entry, and that this title functions as a very traditional one-on-one 2D fighter. The freedom of movement found in the previous game is now absent, and instead players are restricted to fighting on one simple 2D plane. Obviously, just like Street Fighter II and many of its iterations. Speaking of restrictions, the 4-player functionality found in Saturday Night Slam Masters has also been completely dropped from Slam Masters 2, meaning that only one-on-one matches are now possible. Victory is not even achievable through pinfall, submission or countout anymore either. And once again, like Street Fighter II, victory can only be achieved by knocking out or doing more damage to an opponent within a time limit. Slam Masters 2 really is a traditional fighting game. The best way to describe the game is a wrestling themed versus fighter rather than an actual wrestling game. To emphasise the versus fighter playstyle further, the game even includes a combo counter, like many other fighters from the time period. Unique to the game though, that I suppose does separate it from Street Fighter 2 somewhat, is at least the game's controls. Players can still whip their opponent against the ropes to perform drop kicks and clotheslines, and there is a heavy emphasis on grappling moves to be fair to Capcom. So there are certainly still some pro wrestling elements that remain intact in this game's fighting gameplay. It is also possible in the game to reverse grapples by tapping on the grapple button immediately after being grappled by an opponent, adding further to this combat feature. Arcade units let players use the traditional layout of 2 kicks and 2 punch buttons, however an additional grappling button is added to the mix. Like any versus fighter from Capcom really, victory is achieved via winning 2 out of 3 rounds via depleting opponents' life bars. It is of note that these are twice as long as those found within the Street Fighter series. Believe it or not, this game features a mechanic similar to that of Samurai Showdown, which we covered on here already at an earlier date, in that if fighters take a lot of damage, they become enraged and turn red for a limited time, making their attacks stronger during this process, giving a last gasp of hope to those wrestlers who are literally against the ropes. If you played this game back in the day expecting a faithful sequel to Saturday Night Slam Masters, you have certainly been disappointed. However, if you went into this game with an open mind, or went into playing the title expecting a traditional fighter, then there is certainly fun to be had here, and plenty to see. In fact, the Ring of Destruction name is even accurate, as with the right execution, matches can be finished by literally slamming an opponent through the ring itself. Nice. The game includes all 10 of the wrestlers who appeared as fighters in the previous game, along with an additional 4 all-new playable characters, which once again is similarly shared with Super Street Fighter 2. The game, like its predecessor, has its own narrative to explain the appearance of some of the new fighters, along with a reason for much of the game's action taking place in the first place. The previous game, Saturday Night Slam Masters, ends on a cliffhanger, with Capcom Wrestling Alliance owner Victor Ortega announcing he wants to come out of retirement and wrestle the promotion's new champion. This means that Victor Ortega functions as one of the game's 4 new playable characters, and also functions as the final challenge for those who can make it all the way to the end of this game. Ortega is very much positioned as the top dog in this game, which is emphasised further every time he emulates Hulk Hogan's trademark poses. In the previous game, Blood Wrestling Alliance members Jumbo Flapjack and the Scorpion served as the game's final challengers, who were trying to take control of CWA. Both of these men are back in action in Ring of Destruction and are even joined by further BWA members. First we have Rip Saber, who like Triple Bloody H wields a shovel as his main weapon. Whilst on the surface it may appear that he may be some sort of nod to Sergeant Slaughter, or even Bret Hart, bearing in mind that he is from Calgary, he actually seems to be based off of another Calgary based wrestler known as Cole Moffat, who was once very well known in Japan. Rip Saber, like Moffat, inflicts pain more with improvised weapons than his actual wrestling ability. In fact, Moffat partook in many matches involving fire and explosives, which makes this character make a lot more sense. Next up we have Wrath, who is certainly one of the wackier characters in the game. To describe this man, he is the equivalent to The Undertaker or Papa Shango, but turned up to 11. With access to demonic powers not even possible in the real world of professional wrestling. A statement that is a bit paradoxical in itself. This character from New Delhi I would describe as basically Undead Dalsim, and he is probably the most out there of them all included in the game. He even references Kali, a blood-drinking Hindu goddess, in his wing quote. All in all, a very creative addition. The character I found myself playing with the most in this game was Black Widow, a character to me that felt like it offered the best combination of speed and power. This flamboyant character that is almost androgynous looking in appearance is revealed at the end of the game to actually be a woman. Advertisements for this game purposely used neutral Japanese pronouns to leave it up in the air whether or not the character was a male or female, contributing to the Samus-like reveal at the end of the game. It is said that the character was modelled after Mariko Yoshida, a female wrestler known for her flexibility, muscles and a full body costume with a Black Widow spider motif. By now you have probably noticed many of the beautiful stages that this game offers. Whilst the gameplay may not be as dynamic and original as its predecessor, we cannot deny that the stages themselves look great. There are lots of nice subtle details too, such as some of the baddies from the BWA having chains instead of ring ropes on the rings of their stages. The visual appeal is great, so there is much more to see in that regard than with the likes of Saturday Night Slam Masters. Although I am going to nitpick with regards to some of the geography included in this game. I already noted that in the first Slam Masters game they idiotically stated that Biff Slamkovich was from Kiev, Russia, even though Kiev is in the Ukraine. It's as if many Japanese developers failed their geography classes at school, as I recently noticed that the Union flag was used to represent just England in King of Fighters. And I also noticed in another game, I can't remember which one off the top of my head, that it stated that Morrigan was from Edinburgh, which is apparently located in England rather than Scotland according to the game. Whilst Ring of Destruction has no howlers as bad as these, it does state that Rip Sager is from Calgary, Canada. And for some reason Hagar from Final Fight is now from New York instead of Metro City. Now I know Metro City is based on New York anyway, but would it have hurt that much to maintain a bit of continuity between Capcom games and display New York as Metro City instead? I know these are minor things, but why are fighting game developers so geographically confused about the world? I would have assumed people play tested these games. So were they idiots when it came to geography as well? What do you think? Now, putting all this pedantry to one side, Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2 is a decent game. It is just simply not the game Saturday Night Slam Masters fans would have wanted, and instead is a shameless yet decent Super Street Fighter 2 clone. The what could have beens though are certainly a missed opportunity. Just imagine how good it would have been if Capcom developed this game to play like the original, but added the 4 new characters to the mix with all the cool new backdrops. It is a shame really, as that would have been really special, rather than another decent versus fighter, which there was no shortage of in the world anyway. But at least the Slam Masters sequel does exist in some form I suppose, which is something. The game will forever remain more obscure than most Capcom games from the period, as most arcade units were sold in just Japan and Germany, with only a few being placed elsewhere. In fact, from what I could see at least, it looks like this game missed out on a US release altogether, meaning that the biggest wrestling market in the world was deprived of this game. This probably plays into why we hear so little about this game now, considering Americans make up such a large portion of voices within the gaming community online. Lucky for you though, you have a Big Daddy Top Hat here, who is not an American, and I love a good dive into the more obscure side of gaming. So keeping this in mind, which games on here would you like to hear me cover next? Do you think I should cover some more wrestling games perhaps? Let me know in the comment section down below. Feedback is everything. Finally, it is only possible for me to work on these videos full time due to the generous people who back this channel over on Patreon. I made this video for them after they requested a Saturday Night Slam Masters video last week, which people seem to rather enjoy. If you want all my videos early, your name in the credits at the end, and more, then consider backing this channel on Patreon. Huge shout outs go out to some of those who do so. Special thank yous to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Canberra Rambo 82, A Murder of Crows, Azra Rorikai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, Sponge Matt B, Glenny Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Instant Gratification Monkey, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Barbara Kitty, Ron Studd, Chesty LaRue, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Salagny, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlamik Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Punky Tooster, Matthew Windle, Adrian Hannington, Bernard Ng, Marco Soto, Richard Drew Stewart, James McDonald, Jazzy Day, Crazy Yao, Master Jinx, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Dam, Adam Casting, Gregory Smoraduitz, Quick67, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bell, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Andis Reinsbergs, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Dan Barlow Jr., Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, RetroVersion.com, Sin Spaces, Andrew Basansky. Now that is a lot of people I love. Thank you all so much. Yeah. Cheerio.